Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrew Kalat. Thanks for coming. I'm glad that so many... Thank you. How's that? Excellent. I'll have to lean forward a little bit. Or, how about this? Better? Good. This way I can wander a little bit. So good morning. I'm Andrew Kalat. Thanks for coming, guys. I'm glad that I can do a talk about death, and so many people show up, you sick, twisted freaks. This is a tough talk. This is a very personal talk for me, but hopefully it will be valuable to some of you. I will tell you I've got a pretty dense deck, and some of the deck is a little dense on information, but I'm sure we will post it. If not, I'd be happy to get it to you and certainly share with you any of the information that you want. But I want to make sure that we have some time for Q&A, so certain portions I'm going to kind of maybe speed a little bit through. But so, like I said, my name is Andrew Kalat. I will tell you that who I am is not all that important for this particular talk. I'm not really here to sell anything or really promote myself in any way. In fact, this is an awkward talk for me to give because it is talking about a tragedy that I was personally involved with. So, but if you want to know more about me, I'm on the Twitters at Lerg, L-E-R-G, and my buddy and I, Jerry, we do a podcast on blue teaming. So let's move on. So, a couple of warnings. This is not a fun talk. This is, I'll try to give you a couple moments of levity to bring you up, but it's some dark stuff. But we like to think it's important. There's going to be some difficult topics discussed that we don't like to think about, at least most of us, and some not graphic but somewhat disturbing pictures. I will tell you that I'm doing that on purpose, that I'm really trying to connect with you guys to take away the abstraction layer and to make you guys understand as best I can emotionally to understand that this is real and these are real people and this could happen to any of us. So I'm going to try to manipulate your feelings a little bit, and I apologize for that, but it's important. I also want to let you know that these are real people we're talking about, and this is a real situation that was put together with the help of Beth Hamlin, who I'll talk about in a little bit of who she is. She's the widow of Michael Hamlin, who was involved in this incident, who I worked heavily with and what this talk is really about. This was heavily debated in my mind of whether or not I wanted to give this talk, but Beth encouraged it heavily, pushed it, and feels that this information is very useful to share and get out to everybody. So I would not have done it without her support and assistance. So, a couple quick disclaimers. I am no professional for lawyers, CPAs, financial advising. I'm not an accountant. I'm not an investment advisor. I'm not an expert on digital rights. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a funeral director. But I'm going to talk about all those things, so please don't sue me. All right. Who are we talking about? We're talking about a guy by the name of Michael Hamlin, who used to go by the handle of Hacker Joe. Very heavily involved in the InfoSec community for many, many years. He was part of the original Kinshoto group, which did a lot of the capture the flag contests at DEF CON. He'd been to Shmoo many times. Brilliant guy. He was a trained physicist. He had done some work at CERN. One of the smartest guys I've ever known. Somebody I considered a very, very close friend, akin to a brother. Brilliant guy in the InfoSec community. He'd worked for many different groups and in different companies, did his own startup work. Had just before the accident left IBM, where he was a very senior strategist there, and got his first Chief Information Security Officer job at a financial company called Green Sky. So, brilliant guy, did a lot of work in the community. Some of you may know him, some may not. I'm not sure how many folks here knew him, but brilliant guy. And his wife, Beth. Also, important to know a little bit about Beth is that she's also very smart. She is a scientist for the CDC. But she's not an IT person, and that's kind of the crux of this talk. So, very intelligent individual, but not an IT person, whereas Michael very much was an IT person. So what happened? Both Michael and Beth live in the Atlanta area, but they have family in Texas. And so 2 Christmases ago now, in 2014, they were in Texas visiting family and friends. And they were driving along I-20 near Clyde, Texas. in a rental vehicle. Someone going the opposite direction lost consciousness. We're not sure why exactly yet. Crossed the grass median at highway speeds and collided with their vehicle in a front offset crash favoring the driver's side. It was a Nissan Rogue versus a Honda Accord. The results were fairly devastating. This is the Hamlin's vehicle. Michael was pretty much killed instantly. Beth was pretty banged up. She had a broken ankle, pretty heavy concussion, some lacerations, but survived. It was life-flighted out. This is the other vehicle. The other driver survived with, I think, fairly minor injuries, also in the hospital, but not too hurt. Unfortunately, they're far away from everybody when this happened. Beth was life-flighted to a nearby hospital and was basically alone at that point. So they're 1,000 miles from home. They're in this accident, and Beth is now basically on her own in the ICU in a hospital with no way to get a hold of anybody. The person that was expecting them noticed they were overdue, and after about an hour or two after they were overdue, actually pulled up Find Friends app on his iPhone and had the ability to track Michael's phone, and noticed that Michael's phone was sitting along the side of I-20. It was still in the vehicle, along with actually everything else they had, and wasn't moving. He checked again after about 20 minutes, still wasn't moving. He eventually called the police in Clyde, Texas, and found out about the accident, and that's how somebody finally found Beth. Now, what's interesting about this is Beth did not have a phone, didn't have anything on her, and once her friend Gil got to the hospital, an interesting thing came out of this, and this is one of the first lessons that was learned from this, is that we don't memorize phone numbers anymore. So she had no phone, she had none of her contact information, she had no way to get a hold of anybody once she was conscious again and needed to start reaching out to friends and family. Fortunately, Gil did have an iPad, and once she was able to log in with her iCloud account, she was able to get access to her online contact book. But it's interesting that we don't memorize phone numbers, so it was a difficult way to get engaged. So she was able to get online. She was able to find a phone number of one of her brother's websites who had a business, and was able to reach out to her brother's business, even though it was a Saturday or Sunday. Somebody was working, and got a hold of somebody, and that's where she was able to contact family. Again, she's not only is she out of state, but she's also many miles away from family, even in Texas. The other thing that was interesting is how social media became the conduit for communication when something like this happens, and how quickly that spreads once it's on social media. Where we're at this point is now Beth is in the hospital, Michael is no longer with us, and now we're trying to pick up the pieces. So one of the first things is they're on a trip, and they live in Atlanta, but they've got their car in a park and fly in Atlanta. And this is one of the first things that we found when we started engaging. So I'm trying to help from Atlanta, and one of the first things they asked me to do is, hey, can you go get our car out of park and fly? Well, it's really interesting when you reach out to these companies, they have no idea how to deal with this situation. And this is something we saw over and over again, which is that there's very little policy or any way that these guys know how to deal with this. So I probably called Park and Fly up and down the corporate chain, a dozen times, locally, corporate, local headquarters. Couldn't get anybody engaged until I threw a tweet out calling them out. And it's funny how quickly that worked. Within an hour, I had a senior manager engaged, and we had the car within about 5 hours. But what we found was there was very little procedure. They didn't know how to deal with this situation, and that is something that we saw throughout this situation, is that very few companies know how to deal with the unexpected death of a client. So we finally get past a little bit, and we're starting now to get Beth back home. And now we've got to figure out what the heck do we do with Michael's IT footprint, which was massive. And you're going to see some pictures. But Michael was incredibly involved with all aspects of IT. Not only was he working professionally in IT security, but he had a bunch of side businesses. And he had stuff at a colo. He had 10 boxes up and running at a colo. He had a bunch of IT gear at home. And again, going back to remind you about Beth, very smart, but not IT at all. And so part of the lesson here that we'll talk about is that everything IT related, Michael did. And there was an extensive amount of IT gear that we had to go through and figure out what was going on. So he had a huge amount of Gmail, had a bunch of personal domains that he had registered he was operating with, a bunch of co-located servers at a colo in the Atlanta area, was doing hosting on the side of a bunch of stuff, had a ton of home servers, and pretty much everything Apple ever made, Michael still had. In fact, we're still selling off that gear. If you want something from circa 1972, it's probably in the IT hoard that we're going through. We had to start figuring out what was going on. Once the initial shock is over, the brutal reality is life goes on. Whether we're ready for it, whether we like it or not, we still have duties and tasks and responsibilities that we've got to continue on with no matter what's going on in the world. The world doesn't care that we're going through this trauma and this grief and this shock. We've got to figure it out. So, we get Beth back home, and even the basics are a struggle. As happens many, many times, when you've got a strong IT personality, they do all this stuff because they love it. And so Beth really, through no fault of Michael, had no real insight into how any of the IT was set up even in their home, to the point where, again, all of their gear in the car was, in essence, gone or destroyed. So Beth had to go get a new iPad and a new phone. She couldn't even get it on the Wi-Fi because she didn't know the Wi-Fi password. Not because she wasn't smart enough, but that's just what Michael did. He owned it, and he loved it. So, one of the quotes from Beth was, what they think is awesome and fun, in other words, they being us hacker types, is torture to someone in this situation who doesn't know how it's set up. So she's already in a really stressful, grief-stricken situation, and she can't even get the basics going. So this also applied to a lot of the household logistics, paying the bills, paying the mortgage, paying any, the electric bill or the gas bill. All this was done by Michael. And Beth had to figure all this out. It was also all set up, pretty much automated and online. Now here's the problem that we ran into, is everything Michael had pretty much the maximum level of security turned on. So if we wanted to figure any of this out, you think, well, okay, we'll recover his password to his email account and we'll start looking at this stuff. Oh, no, not that easy. So we almost had to do some forensics around their finances, even just to pay the bills. We started grabbing credit card statements. One thing Michael was good about is he kept paper copies, which was odd for Michael, but he did. He's a bit of a hoarder. The problem was on the paper copies of all these credit card statements, the credit card numbers are no longer printed for most of them. And when you start calling all these different services, they want the full credit card number. Didn't have the credit cards. They were destroyed in the crash. So all these little things were just a huge challenge because at no point did Michael really share this with Beth. And again, not out of any maliciousness. He wasn't trying to hide this. He wasn't trying to be controlling. It's just the way their household worked because he was that guy. And, I do the same. I'm engaged. I have a wonderful fiance at home, and I handle a lot of this stuff. Mind you, after this experience, we're going to work on that, but I think this is pretty typical. But almost everything was set up for online bill pay. Almost everything was set up for paper records, or very few paper records. But we had to figure all this out, even just to get stuff going. So we got through some of the basics. Then we started looking at his colo. Now keep in mind that he's got customers at this colo. So he's got servers up and running at this colo, and he's got customers on these servers. We didn't even know who they were. We reached out to the colo. And we tried to explain the situation. Again, we found no procedure built for this sort of situation at all. And it became a very personal sort of project with these guys. Typically what would happen is Beth would have to reach out first. And she would explain, "Hi, I'm Beth Hamlin. My husband is a client of yours and he's dead and I need your help." And there would be silence and difficulty at the other end of the phone trying to get their arms around that. Eventually, we did start to get some traction, and she got me authorized to go in there to figure out what was going on. And I do want to give a shout out to Colo Blocks, which was the Colo over in Atlanta, that once we sort of got them convinced this wasn't a scam and this wasn't anything, nefarious, they really did work with us. But the problem is we had no idea what we were looking at. To give you an idea, here's some of the pictures of these 5 servers that we had up and running at the Colo, front and back, and I was kind of archiving it to figure out. And we went, wow, what is all this stuff? So we took a crash cart, we started plugging in. Fortunately, everything had video output, and figuring out what all this stuff was. We found out he had 3 ESX boxes, 2 different Linux boxes, nothing the same. We figured out he had 10 active IPs, and we started again forensically figuring out what all this stuff was so we could figure out who to contact to tell them, hey, we're going to have to basically turn off your service. Keep in mind, this is now costing a lot of money to Beth because this is expensive gear that's up and running at a Colo, and they're charging every month. So we started booting these with a crash cart and figuring out what they have. And I'll just kind of briefly go through this. But here's CentOS version 4, 6, VMware ESX 3i 351 or 350. Again, all over the map of what he had up and running on these. Apparently, he didn't ever like to run the same thing anywhere because that would make life too easy for us. And ultimately, we had to figure out a way to break into all these servers. Clearly, we had no passwords. None of that was written down. None of that was archived. So, the typical stuff that you would probably imagine. We figured out what they were doing. We created the boot disks. We booted off those either off of a CD or a Blu-ray or a USB stick and typically reset the root passwords, got in, figured out what was on these boxes, figured out the various services that were running, and then using that, figured out how to contact the customers who are on these boxes and tell them, hey, we've got to move your service someplace else because Michael's no longer with us and we don't want to keep running the service. Interestingly, ESX 5.0, no way to really reset the password officially. You have to actually reinstall ESXi to recover, to get into the guest OSs. There's some unofficial methodologies, but that was VMware's official methodology, I will say, is to reinstall, which was a pain. We found out that he had 10 domains registered with a registrar. We found this from a credit card bill. Hey, who is this? Names for I can't remember who it was. Interesting, again, reached out to them. Beth called first, and stunned silence on the other end of the phone. Not sure how to deal with this problem. But they were actually very accommodating and very quickly reset the password, and we were in. They were ones who, we'll talk about this later, certain social engineering opportunities present themselves when you play this particular card. But we'll be nice, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But we found 10 domains. Most of them were related to the Colo or personal projects that Michael had going, and we were able to figure it out. 2 of them were stuff we had to keep up and running. One was actually for Beth's vanity domain that she used, and Beth also had a brother whose business was up and running on this, and we had to get that transferred out. So again, we're really just unraveling all of these things that Michael had going so that there wasn't a disruption to folks who were relying on this, but we had no idea what any of this stuff was, and we had to figure it out. Now we'll talk about the home infrastructure. And I want you to think for a moment that everything you know about IT, you don't know. And you've just gone through this trauma. You've gone through the memorial. You're back in Atlanta, and now you're faced with all of this gear that's up and running in the house, and you have no idea what it is or what it looks like. And I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of a taste of that. You walk in and you start looking at stuff like this: racks and shelves and shelves of gear. And this is probably, I don't know, half of it, right? Wiring closets like this. For as what's the word, anal as Michael was, this wiring drove him crazy, but that's what it was. Tons of this gear, all sorts of stuff. So, it kind of reacted like this to the situation. But we had to figure it out, right? First of all, we don't know if there's other businesses being run out of the house. We don't know how this is. And here is a key thing that I want to mention. All of Michael's gear, his Macs, for instance, he was a heavy Mac guy. Every single box he had, whether it was his MacBook Pro, whether it was his Mac Minis, all had full disk encryption on. Beth had no access to any of their shared memories, their photos, their documents, any of it. So their entire life together that was digital was contained in these encrypted hard drives. And I'll give you a spoiler warning, we never got them back. Ever. We tried. We're still trying. We actually found like a 3-year-old archive on a Drobo that we eventually found like 3 months ago. But the MacBooks, Mac Mini, everything had full disk encryption. Now, okay, fine. You say, well, there's ways around that. We'll deal with it. And here's what we found. Apple and many others have a pretty harsh policy about this, and they should for security reasons. It's really difficult to recover this stuff if you don't have key things. Now, you've got a lot of different options here. You can have a recovery key or your password sent up to the Apple iCloud account. However, if you don't have access to that iCloud account, it's really difficult to get that. So we said, okay, let's figure out what his iCloud account was tied to and start backing our way into that. Well, we figured out he had an Apple.com account, and what it was tied to is tied to one of his vanity domains, which we had actually shut down. So we stood that back up, and we started getting email to it, and we said, okay, great. All right, we'll go on Apple.com and the iCloud and say, hey, reset our password. I went, great, you've got 2-step verification necessary to reset this. So to do that, we need 2 of 3 things. The Apple password, we need access to a trusted device, and or a recovery key. The problem is we had none of these. Couldn't get into any of the trusted devices. His phone, keep in mind, gone. Destroyed, basically. Well, we got it back later, but it had been shut down. The account, his phone account had been shut down. And this is a key lesson. We probably should not have done that. If we'd left his phone account up and running, we probably could have gotten at least like an SMS recovery key sent to the phone, which might have helped. But we didn't have that. Couldn't get into his iPad. Couldn't get into any of his computers. So we had no real way to do this. And Apple has a policy that there's no right of survivorship. So in essence, Apple says, hey, I understand that you're married to this person, but frankly, that's not how we do things. And we find that across the board for different sort of organizations that they have no right of survivorship. The key thing here is that that's fine unless you want stuff or need stuff that's on that computer. So we couldn't get back into his Apple accounts. And I like to think that I'm fairly savvy about IT security things, but there was really no way because the way that these systems are set up are very strong now, and it requires at least some aspect of trusted devices, and we had none of them. And frankly, Apple said, sorry, we're not going to give that to you. That's just the way it is. We apologize. We feel bad, but it's not going to happen. So we didn't have his phone. The phone number was gone. Once we finally got the phone back, it was still operational, but we could never get the phone number operational again because we shut it down. Here's another interesting aspect about Apple. The phones, because of anti-theft from Apple, until you can prove that you bought it, and in other words, show a receipt of ownership, they will not clear that phone and give it to you. So we could never really get that phone truly set back to factory. Plug it into iTunes, reset to factory. Because of anti-theft with Apple, they basically, until you can prove ownership, they will not truly wipe that phone. And we could never get that phone truly cleared to resell it. So unfortunately, we were left with a situation of fail. We just couldn't get into those boxes. which was really disheartening. Beth will tell you now that she's kind of gotten over that, moved on, and it's a year and a half later, and she's dealing with it. But for me, it really sucked. I mean, I'm trying to help this grieving widow, a friend of mine, somebody who I consider basically family, and I'm like, yeah, no problem, I get into those boxes, and I couldn't. Financially, everything was all over the board too. Again, nothing malicious here, but Michael handled most of the finances on his own, and it was all over the map. We still found a new account 2 months ago that we didn't know about because this stuff just wasn't documented. And when you're in this situation, obviously practical aspects of finances matter. So fortunately, they weren't destitute or anything like that, but it's just a lot of work to go track all this stuff down and then get things transferred over and cleaned up. It's not easy, especially when you don't know what you're looking for. Another interesting story was the airline miles. I'm not going to mention who the airline is because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. But this is a good example of these things that we think are valuable don't really transfer at all, and we may not know that. So Michael was a heavy, heavy world traveler. He had over 1.6 million airline miles banked, which I think we calculated at the time was worth about $60,000. And basically this particular airline told Beth, sorry, so sad, too bad, you can't have them. Which is their policy, and that's fine. But you would think for somebody who was the highest status on this airline in a situation like this that they would, perhaps be a little more accommodating to at least the direct family. One thing we found, and this is something we found over and over again, is fortunately I had a friend who happened to work in the IT department of that particular airline. I reached out to them and I explained the situation. They said, that's ridiculous. I know the head of the loyalty program. I'll be right back. And they walked down 2 flights of stairs, and an hour later, we had a resolution. So, and they transfer the miles. So now Beth can travel a certain amount if she would like. But it's interesting how the friend factor played into this, reaching out to folks who know things. In fact, if I had probably somebody who was, a little more senior at Apple, I probably could have gotten through some of the Apple problems as well, but I didn't. Really quickly, just want to kind of talk about some of the major online accounts and their policies because they're varied. Google, for instance, says, hey, when people pass away, that's terrible. We're sorry. There are certain things we can do for you. However, we do consider that account private to that individual, and you don't have a right to it. Now, if you need something specific, maybe we'll take a look at it. Maybe we can get it to you. But in general, we're not just going to reassign it. And you could say, hey, that's a good thing. That is what maybe it should be. But in a circumstance where you need something, they do have this form, and they could say, hey, this is what we need, and send in the death certificate. I will tell you, we tried this and never, ever heard back from Google. We tried 2 or 3 times and could never really get them engaged with us on this. They do have something interesting. And now the key thing I'm going to talk about all these is you've got to think of this ahead of time. If you're in the circumstance, it's too late. It's kind of like doing, breach response. If you're in the breach, it's too late. If you set this stuff up ahead of time, one of the things Google has is an inactivity account manager. The concept is if they detect that your account is inactive for a period of time, you can basically designate it to roll over to somebody else, which is an interesting option. Facebook has a little bit different policy. They have this concept of memorializing accounts, where you can basically take an active user's account and roll it over to an online memorial. So there's certain things they can still post their friends and family, and they can interact with each other and share stories. But it doesn't appear in recommended friends, birthdays, ads, which is kind of creepy when somebody pops up and says, hey, it's their birthday. Yeah, they've been dead 3 years. Thanks, Facebook. No one can log into it. The content stays, or you can pull it down if you want, if you so choose. What's interesting is all of these accounts that have become so pervasive in our society are still sort of getting their arms around how they deal with it when their members die, and how the families want to deal with it. You can also delete the account. You've got to prove it that you're an immediate family member and proof of death. One thing we learned is that the more copies of the death certificate you have, the better off you are, which is a really grisly thing to say, but we went through a lot of copies of the death certificate. Facebook also has the ability to designate a legacy contact, again, ahead of time, where you can basically say, hey, if I were to die, this is the person I want to take over my account for me as a memorial manager. So it's just kind of interesting. So they're kind of getting their arms around it and figure out how they want to deal with that. Twitter has a different policy. Basically, hey, we understand people die. That's terrible. We're sorry. We can basically remove certain images, or we can shut down the account. You got to prove it with, again, proof of death and immediate family kind of thing. Microsoft's a little different. Basically, for the Outlook.com, they're like, hey, we're sorry somebody died. We'll send you a bunch of CDs and Blu-rays and such with their full account details. Just prove it to us. Kind of interesting. A little different. They're not nearly as concerned about not giving access, but they send it to you in archived media, which is kind of weird. We didn't have too much that we need to grab from that, but I thought it was interesting to throw in here. I will say it's a very odd thing in our online world when somebody passes away and they've got a lot of active social media. This was, 3 months ago. It was would have been his 1-year anniversary of his new CISO role at Green Sky Financial. And, I'm browsing through LinkedIn, seeing which recruiters are hitting me up that day. And I see this. Oh, well, that's creepy. Thanks, LinkedIn. So, all right, I thought it was funny. So, one thing I want to talk about is privacy issues. And we're going to kind of get into recommendations and lessons learned here. Not everything that somebody has is meant to be recovered. They have the right to say, hey, I don't want you finding my weird dungeon porn after I'm dead, or whatever. And that is their choice. And I'm not trying to argue that everything that we have should be recoverable after we die. What I am saying is that if we don't think about our key information that is shared with our spouse, that's going to go away too. And so in this case, a whole bunch of financial information, a whole bunch of shared memories, a whole bunch of photos, a whole bunch of documents, the way that their life was run was lost. So that's the point I'm trying to point out here. And there's things we can do to avoid that. So overall, and we're going to get into some dense slides of recommendations here, and I want to make sure we leave a little bit of time for Q&A, but I will make sure these slides are posted. What I would say is that our society is still trying to catch up with the technology side of our life when it comes to death and next of kin issues. We're still figuring this out. We had it pretty well figured out with physical property. We had it pretty well figured out with business, that sort of thing. But we haven't quite figured it out yet with our digital environment and our IT environment, because it's progressing so quickly, especially from a security standpoint. All the security stuff that we build in to keep the bad guys out is great, except when it keeps our loved ones out in an emergency. So the one thing we found is that having a grieving widow call a company and say, I'm sorry, my husband was killed and I need you to help me, works. So be nice, social engineers. It's a really mean card to play, but it's interesting how people inherently believe you, even without a death certificate for most of the time. Now, when you get to these really big companies, they want, proof and whatnot, but it just works. We found that aside from the really big companies, very few companies had a policy to deal with this. Everything was wow, we don't know what to do, let me get a manager involved. And eventually they would do the right thing, but it took a lot of work and a lot of proof. The other thing we found is that Beth having the same last name was really, really helpful. If she had had a different last name, it would have thrown far more roadblocks, especially on the financial accounts, all the different financial accounts we found. So I'm not arguing anything for changing last names or not, but I will tell you that it really did help. I would say that talking to our partners and making sure they can continue and run life after we unexpectedly go away is a form of love. And leaving them unprepared, intentionally or otherwise, is not the best thing to do for our loved ones. So getting into this very specific tactical recommendations. I would recommend that these things. First of all, make sure you have a will. Without a will, life is much more difficult when somebody dies. We're going to talk about something called legacy drawer, which I stole shamelessly from DaveRamsey.com. One thing, though, that I like to talk about on this particular slide is make sure that you are switching roles in your household at least for 1 month per year. That means the other person pays the bills, the other person logs into the accounts, the other person knows where everything's at, they check all the financial accounts. They know how life works in your household, and you're not doing it all one or the other. Now, it's great that you have split roles and you share the duties, but both people need to know how to do everything in case somebody's incapacitated or killed. Passwords and recovery keys. This is a tough topic, but if we are married, one would like to think we trust the person we're married. Most people do. I'm not judging anybody who doesn't. Having a shared spot for password and recovery keys is really handy, and a password manager makes this much, much easier. In fact, we'll talk about something LastPass just added. And I'm not, pimping for LastPass. It's just interesting they added it. The other thing we learned is life insurance. Keep in mind that Michael had switched jobs a month before the accident. A lot of times, life insurance doesn't kick in right away. So again, I'm not a financial advisor, but I do recommend not having your life insurance tied to a specific employer, because if you're in a transition and you were to die, you may not have any life insurance, and your spouse is out of luck at that point. So some recommend 10 times your income in term life. It's up to you. Talk to your advisor. But it's pretty inexpensive and easy to maintain. Then you don't have to worry about your employment status when it comes to making sure that your family's taken care of. The other thing is that if you've got shared digital memories, don't put them on a full disk encrypted drive that nobody else can get into, because we can't get into it. Try to put them someplace we can get them. Iron Key came up as I was talking to folks about this as a good option. Putting a bunch of your critical stuff on an Iron Key, passwords encrypted, making sure your spouse has something along those lines of a way to get to that is just one generic option. Drilling a little bit into this, other things I would say. Make sure your spouse knows how to do the critical stuff in your house. Stuff like turning off the gas, electric, water at the local junction boxes in your house. Just making sure they know the basics. I know that, I'm not playing with or saying there's any specific gender roles here, but men typically take care of this stuff. I know that is in my house and a lot of my friends' houses. So I make sure that my fiance knows how to go do this stuff. If I'm traveling, which I do a lot, I want to make sure she knows how to turn off the gas in the house or the electricity. So I equip them to be able to run the house if I'm not there. I would say be careful with any sort of biometric authentication. Obviously, if somebody's dead, unless you're really grisly, you don't have their biometrics. Sci-fi excluded. If you're doing side businesses, maybe write that down somewhere, please. Be helpful. Make sure both people are on all the financial accounts. I mean, again, assuming you're not hiding money in Kuala Lumpur for your third family that we don't want to talk about. If it's money you want to share, make sure everybody's on all the accounts. It really makes life a lot easier. Getting somebody added to a financial account after somebody's dead is a lot harder than you think it is. And it's the last thing you want to deal with when you're in the middle of that grief. Make sure you've got beneficiaries assigned to those accounts. The other thing I'll say is emergency cash. There are very few problems in life that are made worse by having money available to you. So not having to worry about flying back and forth and keeping things up and running and just having cash. Beth was stuck in a hospital in Texas in the ICU with no phone. Being able to have some money to just go buy a phone so she could contact people made life a lot easier. So having some cash available for emergencies is definitely helpful in these circumstances. So I mentioned this briefly, the legacy drawer. This is kind of a centralized place to put all your important documents. The concept being, if something were to happen, they've got one place to go for everything that they need. Again, it's not fun, right? Nobody wants to do this. But if your spouse is in this situation, this takes so much load off of them while they're dealing with their grief. So it's just a centralized spot for wills, estate plans, all your financial account information. Again, I got this from DaveRamsey.com. Things like the institution, the account number, the password, if you have specific funeral instructions, insurance policies, important documents, deeds, titles for the house and cars, in a centralized spot, important documents like that, previous year's tax returns. Figuring out just how to do taxes has been a challenge for Beth because it was something Michael always had done with all of his side businesses. Passwords, contact info, if you've got lawyers, CPAs, that kind of stuff. And you can store this in a safe deposit box. However, if you do a safe deposit box, make sure both people have keys. If the key's destroyed, this doesn't do us any good. Fireproof safe, that kind of thing. Again, just a centralized spot, maybe update it once a year. I know, it's a laugh a minute to do this kind of stuff, but it does matter. This is something that was just added this month, which was kind of cool. LastPass, which is a centralized password manager, has this concept of emergency access. I'm like, wow, this plays well into my topic. The concept is, if something were to happen, you could have pre-designated somebody to get access to your full LastPass vault or portions thereof. And the concept is, hey, I give it to my friend Bob, and Bob then can go request it, and I have a period of time that I could say, no, Bob doesn't get access to that, or if I'm not there, Bob gets access, which is kind of handy. And by the way, in general, I do recommend password managers. I'm not saying LastPass or anybody else is better, but they're good things to have. This would have made life a lot easier. If Michael had a centralized password manager, we could have saved months and months and months and months of work. Somebody not associated with 1Password put something similar together, which was kind of cool. I just found this searching on the web, a guy by the name of Mike Vardy. I don't know Mike. Hopefully he doesn't mind me using this, but full credit to him. But it's this emergency kit that is really just a little template that he put together to say, hey, if something happens to me, here's a single document that gives his wife all the instructions she needs to get the basics done. So, I know it's kind of small print, but the basics are, hey, here's the password to my 1Password account, here's the PIN to my phone, here's the PIN to this, and here's the basics to at least get her going in the event of emergency. Examples like this. So, here's some other home IT recommendations that, some I've adopted. Maybe a simple network map. Just getting Beth back online when she got back home was a huge challenge with everything Michael had going on. Label the gear. I travel a lot, and I've got labels on all of my gear, like cable modem, wireless access point, router. And so if something were to happen, it's very easy to trace that out. Or if I'm traveling and my fiance calls me and says something's broken, I can say, go find the box labeled this and pull the plug and plug it back in. And keep it uncomplicated. You might have a huge lab that you want to run, which is great, but maybe make that as an offshoot of the critical gear. In other words, the home network should be fairly straightforward so that people can use it fairly easily and aren't having to get ESX servers up and running just to get out to the internet on the Wi-Fi. A couple of final thoughts, and I wanted to leave time for Q&A here. In circumstances like this, the next of kin are under a lot of pressure and stress. There are things we can do to make it easier for them. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. I will tell you, our time here is unknown. Michael and Beth certainly had no idea when they got in the car that morning that was going to be the last day Michael was with us. And that's had a profound impact on my life. So we don't know how long we have. I do think it's important that we make that time worth it. I know it's not fun, but I do think it's important to talk to our partners about death and what we would do in making sure that we have prepared for them to continue on, because whether we like it or not, life does continue. And I would say, think about what would happen and what you can do to help. So, just one more quote, and then we'll open up to Q&A. Because everybody's got to reference Shawshank occasionally, because, it's what we do. But I do want to open up to questions. We've got some time. Before I do that, I do want to introduce one other person who was kind enough to come up, which is Beth Hamlin came up to join me for the talk. So she wants to come up. We can answer some questions while we've got some time. All right, I've got some bright lights, so I'll try to see some hands. Right here, sir?
I actually have an answer versus a question.
Thanks. No, some good points I want to repeat there so we get it on tape and for everyone. The comment was wills are very important, life insurance is very important, but trusts are really critical for making it easier for other folks to get access to resources. And I think that's a great point. I did forget to add that. I don't know a lot about trusts, so I don't know a lot about all the legal stuff we went through here, but I do think it's worth looking at. And thank you for your compliment. Other questions, comments? Sir? So the question is, would a power of attorney have been helpful beforehand, and would an estate plan or estate plan attorney have been useful in this circumstance? Do you know?
So my thoughts on, can you hear me? I'm not sure about that. So my thoughts on that are, yes, it could have been helpful from a financial perspective, but most people don't think when they're discussing with estate planning their passwords to all of their gear. So although that would have made it smoother from a financial perspective and transfers and everything else, I don't think that necessarily would have addressed the issues with all of the IT gear that we ran into.
Right here. Wow, good question. The question is, do we have any tips for software usability designers of what they could do differently to make life easier? No, but that's a great thing to think about. So I haven't had that question before. The one thing like what LastPass did with that emergency contact I thought was pretty handy and a brand new thing. So I see some folks starting to catch up with this, but that's a huge question with a lot of implications. Let me think about that. Unless... Oh, there you go. Sir? Okay. That's really important. Let me echo that real quick, which is that, thank you for bringing that up. The comment was, there's lots of sales guys, and I use the term sales droids, who call themselves estate planners who are just selling you product. Be very careful about that. Go to a good lawyer, not a sales guy. Go ahead. Yeah, lawyers who do specialize in it. That's interesting. So the comment is lawyers typically only respect a power of attorney for about 6 months. So it's something you'd have to renew on a regular basis kind of thing. Wow. Sorry.
I'll make one quick comment on that. There is a not really what I call a statute of limitations, but a lot of these points and other things that many of the companies will allow you to transfer from your dead spouse to you, they require you do it within 1 year of death. So there's some things that do have time-critical measurements.
The other thing I'd say, too, is that if you're not married, this is a lot more difficult. So if you're a domestic partner or that sort of thing, life is definitely more difficult in this circumstance. I know we're running out of time for the next speaker, but happy to take in a few more. Go ahead. Okay, so if you're not married, financial power of attorney and direct power of attorney is recommended. And medical power of attorney, sure. Hopefully we're not getting kicked off here, but go ahead. It's an interesting point. Again, not a lawyer, so good to hear this. When someone is dead, the power of attorney sometimes loses effectiveness. So it's great if they're alive and perhaps incapacitated, but once they're dead, maybe not. I'm happy to take as many questions as we can, but I know we're getting kicked off the stage here in a minute, so maybe we'll rally someplace else, but go ahead here, ma'am. Good question. why would I recommend a password manager over just writing passwords on a website? And I will tell you that this is a careful balance of risk versus accessibility. The reason why I like the password manager in this particular circumstance, and you've got to figure out for you, is it's a central place that can always be reachable no matter where you're at. I don't have to find that piece of paper. And I like the fact that I can make customized, unique passwords and store them or rotate them easily on a password manager. But you bring up a good point. It's also a central point of attack. And if somebody breaches my password manager, they've got my entire life. So you've got to secure that very, very carefully. But it's a balance of risk. So I apologize. I'd love to talk to you more. Happy to talk in the hallway. Beth and I will be here for a while, but they're kicking me off the stage. So thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate it. Thank you.